The part of your brain responsible for creativity, intuition, and building the life you actually want has been quietly shutting down. And most people have no idea it's happening right now, in this very moment, as they breathe. I know that sounds extreme. I thought so too the first time I came across the research. I was sitting in my home office late one evening, half distracted, scrolling through a neuroscience paper that a colleague had forwarded me with no context, just a message that said, "_0." The paper described a study where researchers scanned the brains of a group of long-term meditation practitioners and compared them to a control group of healthy, functioning adults with no meditation background. The difference wasn't subtle. There was an entire region of the prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain linked to focus, decision-making, and what the researchers called generative thinking, that was significantly more active in the practitioners. Not because they were smarter, not because they had better genes, because of how they breathed. That sentence stopped me cold. I remember the exact feeling. The room was quiet, the kind of quiet that makes small sounds louder. And I could hear my own breath, shallow, fast, barely reaching my chest. I sat with that awareness for a moment and felt something uncomfortable settle in. How long had I been breathing like that? Not just tonight, every day, every meeting, every decision, every moment where I needed clarity and couldn't find it. The researchers weren't making a soft claim either. They were specific. Certain patterns of breathing directly influence which brainwave states dominate your mental activity, and the brainwave state most of us live in by default, fast, reactive, stress-driven, is the one that neurologically blocks the very processes you need to change your circumstances. It doesn't matter how motivated you are. It doesn't matter how clear your goals are. If your brain is running in that frequency, it is physically less capable of creative connection, less capable of seeing opportunity, less capable of forming the new beliefs that actually shift behavior. And it stays that way for as long as your breathing tells it the threat is still present. What struck me most wasn't the science itself. It was what came next in the paper. The researchers had found nearly identical breath ratios described in ancient records, Tibetan monastic text, Vedic breathing manuals, fragments from Egyptian temple practice. Different cultures, completely separate from each other, had independently arrived at the same numbers, the same inhale lengths, the same hold durations, the same exhale ratios, and all of them described the result the same way: a feeling of expansion, a sense of mental clarity that felt almost physical, a state where what you focused on seemed to become more real, more reachable, more inevitable. I closed my laptop that night, not with excitement, but with something quieter. The feeling that something important had been sitting right in front of me my whole life, disguised as something ordinary, something I did 30,000 times a day without a single conscious thought. If any of this is landing for you the way it landed for me, subscribe and like this. It genuinely helps more people find this kind of content. I didn't try the technique that night. That's the honest version of this story, and I want to give you the honest version. I bookmarked the paper, told myself I'd come back to it, and went to bed thinking about it without doing anything about it. That's how it goes, right? You find something that could actually help, and you file it away under __, quote, _to__. I did that for almost 2 weeks. What changed wasn't a dramatic decision. It was a bad morning. The kind where you wake up already tired, already behind, already running the same low-level anxiety that follows you from room to room like a sound you can't quite locate. I'd had a run of those mornings, and I remember standing in the kitchen, coffee in hand, staring at nothing in particular, and thinking, something has to be different today. Not my schedule, not my to-do list. Something underneath all of that. I pulled up the paper on my phone. I read the breath sequence again. It was simple enough that I felt almost embarrassed for having postponed it. I set a timer, sat down at the kitchen table, and started. What happened in the next 7 minutes genuinely surprised me, and not in the way I expected. I didn't feel calm exactly. I felt awake in a way that was different from caffeine, different from a good night's sleep. Sharper, but without the edge of tension that usually comes with sharp. Like a window had been opened in a room I hadn't realized was stuffy. And then I understood why the researchers had flagged this. It wasn't subtle. It was measurable, even just from the inside. Something had shifted, and it had shifted fast. The question I couldn't stop thinking about was, if this works this quickly, why does almost nobody know how to do it correctly? Most people who try breath work once and feel nothing are not doing it wrong because they lack discipline. They are doing it wrong because nobody told them the thing that actually matters before you start. And without it, the whole sequence is just controlled hyperventilation with good intentions. I learned this the hard way. After that first morning at the kitchen table, I was convinced. I told a friend about it, a guy named Marcus who had been dealing with burnout for the better part of a year, and he tried it that same evening. He called me the next day and said it did nothing. Flat zero. I was confused because my experience had been so immediate and so clear. We went through it together on the phone, step by step. And that is when I realized what had happened. Marcus had gone straight to the breathing pattern without any preparation. He had skipped what I had done almost accidentally that first morning, which was sitting still for a few minutes before starting, just noticing his body, letting the initial restlessness settle. He had treated it like a task to complete rather than a state to enter, and the result was nothing, because his nervous system never had the chance to shift out of the mode it was already running in. You cannot rewire a circuit while the current is still spiking through it. This preparation layer is the piece that almost every popular breakdown of breathwork leaves out, because it is unglamorous and it does not make for a compelling headline. But it is the difference between a technique that changes something and one that leaves you feeling faintly ridiculous on your kitchen floor. The 3-layer architecture I mentioned earlier. This is where it starts. Not with the breath pattern itself, with the conditions that make the breath pattern actually land. Think of it like soil before seeds. You can have the best seeds in the world, but if the ground is compacted and dry, nothing takes root. The preparation phase is how you loosen the ground. And once I understood that, everything about those first 2 minutes started to make a different kind of sense. What you are doing in those opening minutes is sending a very specific signal to your nervous system. Not through intention, not through willpower, through the physical act of stillness and awareness. Your body has been interpreting your shallow, rapid breathing as low-level danger for hours, possibly all day. The moment you sit upright, slow down, and place your attention on the actual sensation of your breath without trying to change it yet, you are beginning to interrupt that signal. Not override it, interrupt it. There is a difference. And that difference is everything. The interruption is what opens the door to the next layer, and without it, that door stays shut no matter how perfectly you execute the counting. Here is something that genuinely shifted how I understood all of this, and I want you to stay with me because this part matters more than the technique itself. I went back to that research paper and read the section I had skimmed the first time, the part about why ancient practitioners built such elaborate preparation rituals before any core practice. The researchers noted something that sounds almost too simple to be significant. Every tradition they studied insisted that the practitioner must first arrive fully in the present moment before attempting to shift their state. Not relax, not calm down, arrive. Meaning, stop running on autopilot. Stop letting the mind half live somewhere else while the body goes through motions. The neuroscience behind this is surprisingly clean. When your attention is fragmented, which is the default for most adults in the middle of a normal day, your brain is allocating processing resources across multiple incomplete loops. Unfinished thoughts, pending tasks, background worries. Each of those loops is a small but real drain on the coherence of your neural activity. And coherence, the degree to which different regions of your brain are firing in coordinated patterns, is precisely what the breathing sequence is designed to increase. If you start the sequence while your attention is scattered, you are trying to tune an instrument while someone else is playing random notes on it at the same time. The preparation phase is simply the act of closing those loops temporarily, not solving them, just setting them down. And the researchers found that this alone, before any specific breath pattern, produced measurable shifts in heart rate variability and prefrontal activity within 90 seconds in most subjects. 90 seconds of genuine, undivided present moment awareness was enough to begin changing the brain's operating state. That number stopped me cold, because it meant the barrier to entry was not commitment or discipline or time. It was attention. Just attention. And if that is true, then what happens when you pair that quality of attention with the precise breath sequence that follows? Well, that is exactly where this gets interesting. Two completely separate civilizations, with no known contact between them, wrote down the same breath ratios. Not approximately the same numbers. And when modern researchers ran those ratios through clinical measurement, they matched the parameters that produce peak coherence in the human brain almost exactly. I want to be honest about what I felt when I fully understood that. It was not excitement. It was something closer to unease, because it meant one of two things. Either these ancient cultures were far more scientifically advanced than we give them credit for, or there is something about the human nervous system that is so consistent, so universal, that any civilization paying close enough attention over enough generations would eventually find the same frequencies. Either way, the implication is the same. This is not a cultural practice. This is not a belief system. This is a biological fact that got dressed in different ceremonial clothing depending on where it was discovered. The clothing changed. The numbers stayed the same. I spent a week going back through what researchers had documented about breath practices in different traditions. Tibetan monks working with what they called wind energy. Indian yogis mapping the relationship between breath rhythm and states of awareness. Records from Egyptian temple training that describe specific counts used before entering what the text called the inner chamber of the mind. None of these traditions knew about each other in any meaningful way, Yet the core ratios they had each arrived at, the relationship between the inhale length, the hold, and the exhale, clustered around the same narrow range. The range that, when measured in modern subjects, consistently produced the highest heart rate variability scores and the clearest gamma wave signatures. When I showed this to Marcus, the same friend who had failed his first attempt because he skipped the preparation phase, he went quiet for a moment and then said something I have not forgotten. He said, "So they were doing neuroscience. They just did not have the machines to name what they were measuring." And that is exactly it. The machines came later. The discovery came first, thousands of years earlier, through nothing but careful observation of what happened when people breathed in specific ways over long periods of time. What happens to their thinking? What happens to their decision-making? What happens to the quality of what they create and attract into their lives? The research did not mystify that process. It clarified it. And that clarity is what makes the technique teachable in a way that ancient temple practice never quite was. Because back then you had to be selected, trained, initiated. Now the mechanism is understood well enough that anyone who follows the structure correctly can access the same state. That shift from exclusive to accessible is the actual story here. But here's the part that nobody talks about, and it is the part that finally explained to me why most people never feel any of this at all. Picture the average adult moving through a normal Wednesday. They wake up to an alarm, which is already a stress signal. They check their phone before their feet hit the floor, flooding their prefrontal cortex with information and social comparison before their brain has even finished its morning transition out of sleep. They drink coffee on an empty stomach, which spikes cortisol. They sit in traffic or on a crowded bus with their shoulders hunched and their jaw tight. And through all of this, they are breathing. Short, chest-driven breaths that barely move the lower lungs at all. Maybe 12 to 18 of them per minute. Fast enough that the carbon dioxide balance in their blood stays elevated, which keeps the nervous system in a mild but constant state of alert. By the time that person sits down at a desk, or stands in front of a task they need to focus on, or tries to make a decision that matters, their brain is already running 3 hours deep into a stress cycle they never consciously entered. They did not choose to feel anxious or blocked or creatively flat. Their physiology chose it for them, automatically, through the accumulated signal of every shallow breath they took since they opened their eyes. And because it is gradual, because it builds slowly over hours rather than arriving all at once, most people never connect the feeling to the cause. They think the problem is their mindset, or their circumstances, or some lack of motivation or discipline. They never think to look at the thing they have been doing 30,000 times today without once paying attention to it. That is the trap. And the reason it matters so much is that you cannot think your way out of a physiological state. You cannot motivate yourself out of a nervous system running on emergency settings. The entry point is not the mind. It is the breath. And what happens when you finally use that entry point correctly is something most people have genuinely never felt before in their adult lives. Your body is running a silent emergency right now. And the worst part is that you have been so used to it for so long that it feels completely normal. That sentence sounds dramatic, I know, but stay with me for a moment, because this is the piece that shifted everything for me. Not just intellectually, but in a way I could feel in my chest the second I understood it. We talked about shallow breathing and the stress cycle it creates, But I want to go one level deeper, because understanding what is actually happening inside your body when you breathe that way changes how urgently you want to stop. Your vagus nerve runs from the base of your brain all the way down through your chest and into your abdomen. It is the longest nerve in your body, and it is essentially the main line of communication between your brain and every major organ below your neck. When it is functioning well, it keeps your heart rate balanced, your digestion running, your immune system regulated, and your mind in a state that is calm enough to think clearly and creatively. Researchers measure its function through something called vagal tone, and high vagal tone is consistently associated with better emotional regulation, stronger resilience, and higher cognitive performance across the board. Now here is what shallow chest breathing does to that system. When you breathe high and fast, the lower portion of your lungs, where the vagus nerve runs closest to the surface, barely moves. The gentle, rhythmic pressure that stimulates vagal activation simply does not happen. Over hours and days and years of breathing this way, your vagal tone drops. And when vagal tone drops, your nervous system loses its primary brake on the stress response. Your body stays in a state of low-level readiness, not full panic, just a constant low hum of alert that never fully resolves. Your thinking narrows, your creativity compresses. Your ability to hold a clear vision of something you want and actually move toward it gets quietly throttled, not because you are doing anything wrong, but because your nervous system is doing exactly what it was designed to do when it believes the environment is not safe enough to relax into. The most devastating part of this is not the physical effect. It is what it does to your sense of possibility. When you are running in that compressed state day after day, your brain starts filtering your entire experience through a lens of caution and limitation. Not dramatically, just consistently. The idea that feels exciting also feels risky. The decision that could change things also feels premature. The version of yourself that knows what it wants keeps getting overruled by the version that is quietly, invisibly convinced that now is not the right time. And that feeling is not a personality trait. It is a physiological state. It is your body running its emergency programming on a loop with no off switch in sight, until you give it one. What the ancient practitioners understood, and what the research now confirms, is that you cannot talk yourself out of this state. You cannot think positive thoughts hard enough to override a nervous system that is stuck in alert. The signal that keeps the system locked has to be interrupted at the level where it originates, which is the body, not the mind. And the most direct, most accessible, most consistently effective way to interrupt it is through the breath. Not because breathing is magical, because breathing is the one physiological function that is both automatic and consciously controllable. It is the bridge between the part of your nervous system you can direct and the part that runs without your permission. And when you know how to use that bridge deliberately, you can walk across it in minutes. That is what the ancient traditions were doing. Not performing rituals, not accessing supernatural states. Crossing that bridge systematically, with precision, using patterns they had refined over generations of observation. And the destination on the other side of that bridge is not some mystical, altered state. It is simply your own nervous system finally operating the way it was designed to, without the noise, without the compression, without the constant low-grade alarm pulling every thought and decision slightly off-center. I want you to really sit with that for a moment, because what I am about to describe is not a relaxation technique. It is a restoration. And there is a meaningful difference between the two. The researchers who documented ancient breath practices across multiple traditions noted something that took me a while to fully absorb. These were not spiritual communities stumbling onto relaxation by accident. They were, in every case, systematically rigorous. They kept records. They tracked outcomes across practitioners over years. They eliminated variables. They refined ratios until the results became consistent and reproducible. They were, in the most precise sense of the word, scientists. They just used human bodies as their instruments instead of machines. What they were measuring, even without the vocabulary to name it, was the relationship between breath pattern and mental state. Specifically, which patterns reliably produced the conditions under which people could access their highest capabilities. Not occasionally, not randomly, reliably, on demand, in a predictable window of time. They found that certain ratios, when applied with attention and correct physical alignment, produced a shift in mental clarity and creative capacity that was so consistent across different people that it could not be coincidence or suggestion. Something real was happening, something biological. And they built entire training systems around reproducing it because they understood, intuitively and practically, that a mind in that state was capable of things a mind in survival mode simply was not. The protocol they left behind is what I'm going to walk you through. But before we get there is one more thing you need to understand about what actually happens inside your brain the moment the shift begins. Right now, before you change a single thing about how you are breathing, your body already knows something is about to shift. And that knowing is not psychological, it is physical. It is already happening in your nervous system, whether you are aware of it or not. I want to walk you through the first phase exactly as I experienced it, not as a set of instructions to follow passively, but as something you can feel in real time as I describe it. Because the preparation phase, the part we covered earlier that most people skip, is not just a warm-up. It is the actual beginning of the rewire. And the moment I stopped treating it as a preamble and started treating it as the first meaningful step, everything about my results changed. Find a position where your spine can be long without effort, not rigid, long. There is a difference you can feel in your back muscles if you pay attention to it. Sit where you are right now if you can. Let your shoulders drop away from your ears, not forced down, just released. Feel the weight of your arms hanging from your shoulder joints. If you have been holding tension there, and most people have been holding it for hours without realizing, that release alone produces a subtle but real change in how your chest can move. Now place one hand on your chest and one on your lower belly, just below your navel. Do not change your breathing yet. Just breathe however you are breathing right now, and notice which hand moves more. This is the observation I mentioned earlier, and I want to be honest about what I felt when I first did it. My chest hand was moving significantly. My belly hand was almost still. I had been breathing into the top third of my lungs essentially all day, every day, for as long as I could remember. The lower two-thirds were barely participating. And the lower two-thirds are where the majority of the oxygen exchange actually happens, where the vagus nerve runs closest to the surface, where the breath has the most direct access to the systems that regulate your state. That single observation, lasting maybe 10 seconds, was genuinely uncomfortable. not in a dramatic way, in the quiet way that real recognitions tend to be uncomfortable, the kind where something clicks and you cannot unclick it. Now begin the grounding sequence. Breathe in for 4 counts through your nose. As you inhale, focus on sending the breath down first, into your belly, letting it expand outward before your chest rises at all. Hold for 2 counts. Then exhale through your mouth for 6 counts, letting your chest soften first, then your belly drawing gently inward at the end. 4 in, 2 hold, 6 out. Repeat this 8 times. Keep one hand on your chest and one on your belly, and let the feedback of your own hands guide you. You are not performing this. You are learning the actual physical mechanics of your own breathing for possibly the first time. By the 4th or 5th cycle, something will begin to change. The room might seem slightly quieter, even if the actual noise level has not changed. Your jaw may unclench in a way that makes you realize it was clenched. Your vision may soften at the edges. These are not poetic descriptions. These are direct physical indicators that your parasympathetic nervous system is beginning to activate, that your body is receiving and responding to the signal it has been waiting for, possibly all day. The signal that the emergency is over, that it is safe to shift out of alert and into something wider and more capable. Breathe through the full 8 cycles without rushing. The counting is not a performance, it is a regulator. The specific ratio of a shorter inhale, a brief hold, and a longer exhale is not arbitrary. The extended exhale is the mechanism that directly stimulates vagal activation. Every time your exhale is longer than your inhale, you are pressing a biological reset that your body already knows how to respond to. You are not forcing anything. You are removing the obstacle that was preventing your system from doing what it naturally wants to do. When you finish the 8th cycle, pause for a moment and notice the quality of your awareness, not what you are thinking about. The quality of the awareness itself. Whether it feels slightly wider, slightly less urgent, slightly more present than it did 2 minutes ago. That shift, however subtle it might be right now, is the neurological ground you needed before anything else in this sequence can take root. And what comes next is where the real depth of this begins. Because here is what almost nobody talks about when they describe breath work, and it is the thing that stopped me mid-session the first time I noticed it. Around the 5th or 6th cycle of that grounding sequence, something happened that had nothing to do with relaxation. My thinking did not slow down. It cleared. There is a specific difference between those two things that is very hard to describe until you feel it yourself. Slowing down is what happens when you are tired. Clearing is what happens when the interference finally stops. It is the difference between a radio turned down and a radio finally tuned to the right frequency. And the moment that clearing happened, I understood for the first time why the preparation phase was not optional. It was not setting the stage for the technique. It was already the technique. And what I felt in the next phase, when the core sequence began, built on that clearing in a way that I was completely unprepared for. What happened next in that session was so unexpected that I actually stopped mid-breath and opened my eyes just to check that I was still sitting in the same room. The grounding sequence had done exactly what I described. The clearing had happened. The interference had dropped. And now, moving into the core phase, I felt the difference between a nervous system that was still running background noise and one that had finally gone quiet enough to actually receive something. It is a distinction that matters more than I can explain in words, but I will try, because it is the reason the second phase works at all. The core sequence has a specific ratio. Inhale for 6 counts. Hold for 4. Exhale for 8. Hold for 4. 6, 4, 8, 4. That is it. On the surface, it looks almost too simple to produce anything significant, but the simplicity is deliberate because the counting is not the point. The counting is a vehicle. What you are actually doing with those ratios is slowing your total breath cycle to approximately 5 full breaths per minute. And 5 breaths per minute is the rate at which something remarkable happens between your heart and your brain. Researchers who study the relationship between breathing and heart function have found that at around 5 cycles per minute, the rhythms of your heart rate and your brainwave activity begin to synchronize in a way that does not happen at faster rates. They call this coherence, not a metaphor for feeling good, an actual measurable alignment between two biological systems that normally operate somewhat independently. When coherence peaks, the signal noise between your body and your brain drops, and the quality of information moving between them sharpens dramatically. Ancient practitioners described this as the moment the mind becomes still enough to hear itself clearly. The neuroscience describes it as the moment gamma wave production increases and the prefrontal cortex reaches peak receptivity. Both descriptions are pointing at the same thing. Now, begin. Inhale through your nose for 6 counts, slow and steady. Belly first, then chest. As you inhale, bring your attention to the physical sensation of the air moving through your nostrils, the slight coolness of it, the expansion in your ribs, the feeling of your chest lifting gently at the top of the breath. Do not add anything to this. Just feel it with full attention. Hold for 4 counts. Keep your body soft during the hold. The hold is not a bracing or a tensing. It is a stillness. A pause between two motions, like the moment at the top of a wave before it breaks. Then exhale for 8 counts through slightly parted lips, slow and controlled. Chest releasing first, then belly drawing inward at the very end. Hold empty for 4 counts before the next inhale begins. 6, 4, 8, 4. Stay with this rhythm. Let the counting recede into the background after the first 2 or 3 cycles, the way you stop consciously tracking your steps when you have been walking for a while. You do not need to think about the numbers. You need to stay present inside the breath itself. Add the visual element on the 3rd cycle. As you inhale, imagine light entering through the crown of your head, not as a forced visualization, but as a gentle direction of attention, the way you might notice sunlight coming through a window without staring at it. Let that sense of light move down through the center of your skull, spreading through your chest on the hold, traveling down your spine on the exhale, settling into your lower body on the empty hold. The visual is not decoration. It is a deliberate engagement of your visual cortex alongside your respiratory system, a dual activation that research has consistently linked to faster and deeper shifts in neural coherence. You are not imagining light for the sake of it. You are using the brain's visual processing system as an additional channel for the same signal your breath is already sending. Continue the cycle. 6, 4, 8, 4. Light in, spreading, flowing, settling. And stay with it, because what starts to happen in the body around the third or fourth full cycle is the part that nobody warns you about. The first thing I noticed was warmth across my sternum. Not a surface warmth, but something deeper, like heat spreading from the inside of my rib cage outward. Then a heaviness in my hands, a pleasant, grounded heaviness, like my palms were made of something slightly denser than usual. My hearing seemed to sharpen and soften at the same time, close sounds becoming clearer, while background noise receded further. And underneath all of it, a quality of stillness that I can only describe as the absence of the thing I had not even realized was always present. That low hum of urgency, that invisible pressure that sits behind every thought in a normal day, was gone. Not suppressed, gone. I had felt relaxed before. I had felt calm before. This was neither of those things exactly. This was alert without urgency, open without effort, present without strain. The kind of state where a thought you have been trying to think for weeks can suddenly arrive fully formed, not because you worked for it, but because the interference that was blocking it finally cleared completely. And here is what the researchers found when they measured subjects in this state, and why it matters for everything that comes in the phase that follows. The state you just entered is the most neurologically receptive your brain will be all day, and if you close it without using it deliberately, you have left the most valuable window of your entire waking hours completely empty. That is not a motivational phrase. That is a description of what the research shows about what happens in the brain during and immediately after the kind of coherent state we just moved through together. And understanding it changes how you approach the third phase entirely. Because the third phase is not a cool down. It is the most precise and purposeful part of the whole sequence. Let your breath return to its natural rhythm now. Do not control it. Just let it find its own pace. And notice that the pace it finds after the core sequence is slower and deeper than the one it had before you started. That shift in your resting breath is not nothing. That is your nervous system recalibrating its baseline, even slightly, even temporarily, in the direction of the state you just created. Your body is already beginning to treat this as a new reference point. Place both hands over your heart, not for ceremony, for attention. Your hands on your chest direct your awareness to that area of your body in a way that is physiologically useful, because the heart has its own neural network, its own electrical field, and its own influence on brain activity. When your attention and your physical touch converge on the same place, the signal clarity in that region increases. The ancient practitioners who placed hands on the chest during integration phases were not performing a gesture. They were using a body-based attention tool that we now have the neuroscience to explain. Now bring to mind the one thing you most want to create in your life right now. Not a wish, not a hope, a specific, concrete scene of that thing already being real. If it is a relationship, see yourself in a moment within it. A specific, ordinary moment. Morning light through a window, a voice you recognize, a feeling of ease and warmth that is simply the texture of that life. If it is a professional achievement, see the moment after it has landed, not the achievement itself, but the quiet aftermath of it, the feeling in your chest when the thing you worked toward is simply true. If it is a quality of life, a sense of freedom, a feeling of security. Make it as physically specific as you can. Where are you? What does the air feel like? What is the quality of the light? The more sensory and concrete the image, the more neural resources it engages, and the more powerfully it writes into the state you are currently in. Hold that image. Hold the feeling of it, and breathe naturally inside it for 2 full minutes. This is not visualization as motivation. This is not positive thinking as a performance. What you are doing right now is using a narrow but real biological window. The period of elevated neural plasticity that follows coherent breathwork to encode a specific pattern of thought and feeling as deeply as possible into your brain's existing neural architecture. Your brain is, in this moment, more capable of forming new connections and less defended against new information than it will be for most of your day. The image you hold during this window does not just pass through your mind the way ordinary thoughts do. It lands differently. It has more traction. And the research on state-dependent learning confirms that what you encode in an altered or elevated state is retained more strongly and influences behavior more consistently than what you encode in your ordinary baseline state. The ancient practitioners called this phase the sealing, not a mystical term, a practical one. They had observed over generations of tracking results across many practitioners that the integration period after the core breath sequence was where the practice either became permanent or faded. If you moved immediately back into ordinary activity after the core phase, the shift dissolved quickly. If you used the window deliberately, with clear intention and genuine emotional engagement, the effects compounded over days and weeks into something that began to look like a fundamentally different relationship with your own life. They called it sealing because you were fixing something in place before the window closed. Stay with your image. Feel the emotional reality of it as fully as you can. Gratitude works especially well here. Not forced gratitude, but the genuine felt sense of what it would feel like to look at your life and find that thing already in it. That specific emotional frequency, when combined with a coherent brain state, is the precise condition under which your reticular activating system, the part of your brain that filters what you notice and what you overlook in your daily experience, begins to recalibrate toward the pattern you are holding. You do not attract things by wanting them. You begin to notice and respond to things that were always there but previously filtered out, because your brain has now logged them as relevant, as recognizable, as worth attending to. Take 3 slow, natural breaths inside your image. Feel the scene as real. Feel the gratitude of it as present. And then, when you open your eyes, do not rush. Sit with the quality of the state for another 30 seconds before you reach for your phone or stand up or speak. That 30 seconds of gentle transition is not indulgence. It is the difference between the state integrating and the state collapsing. And what happens in your body and mind over the next 24 to 48 hours, if you protect that transition, is the part of this that I genuinely did not expect. Here is something that most people who teach manifestation have completely backwards, and getting it wrong is exactly why the majority of people who try this kind of work see nothing change in their actual lives. We covered what happens during the integration phase, the sealing, the window of elevated plasticity where intention writes more deeply than usual. But there is a mechanism behind why visualization works at all that goes much deeper than most explanations ever reach. And once you understand it at this level, the whole picture shifts from something that sounds spiritual into something that sounds almost disturbingly practical. Your brain has a filtering system. It processes an enormous amount of sensory information every second, far more than your conscious mind could ever handle. So it filters. It decides, based on patterns it has learned to treat as relevant, what to surface to your awareness and what to discard. You walk through a busy space and your name, spoken quietly across a crowded room, cuts through all other noise and reaches you instantly. Your brain was not consciously listening for it. It had simply logged your name as high priority and kept a background process running for it at all times. This filtering system operates on the same principle for everything in your life. What your brain has logged as relevant, it will find. What it has not logged, it will overlook, even if it is directly in front of you. Now here's the part that matters. Your brain does not update its relevance filters based on what you want. It updates them based on what you repeatedly experience as emotionally significant. A thought you have once does not move the needle. A thought you hold with genuine emotional charge repeatedly in a state of high neural receptivity begins to register as a pattern worth tracking. And once your filtering system starts tracking a pattern, your experience of daily life begins to change, not because the world rearranged itself, but because you are now noticing things that were always there and always being filtered out. The ancient practitioners who described the integration phase as the most important part of the whole sequence were not being mystical. They had observed through generations of watching what happened to people who practiced this way consistently that the quality and emotional depth of what you hold during the sealing window directly determined how quickly your waking life began to reflect what you were practicing. Not as magic, as perception. Your brain starts scanning for what you have given it to scan for, and what you find in your daily experience shifts accordingly. This is why the visualization during the third phase cannot be passive. It cannot be a vague positive feeling about a general direction you want your life to move in. It needs to be specific, sensory, and emotionally real enough that your filtering system registers it as something worth tracking. The more concrete the scene, the more neural pathways it engages simultaneously, and the stronger the signal it sends to the part of your brain responsible for pattern recognition and opportunity detection. You are not wishing, you are programming. And the distinction between those two things is the entire difference between people who do this work and feel uplifted but see no change, and people who do this work and find their circumstances beginning to quietly reorganize around what they have been holding. I watched this happen with Marcus. After his failed first attempt, after we talked through the preparation phase and he understood why it mattered, he committed to doing the full sequence every morning for 2 weeks. He was skeptical. He was also desperate enough to try anything, which sometimes produces the best results because it tends to produce genuine effort rather than casual dabbling. Around day 4, he called me and said something odd had happened. He had been sitting in a coffee shop and overheard a conversation at the next table about a project in exactly the field he had been visualizing working in. He almost did not lean in, but something made him turn, and that conversation led directly to an introduction that changed the direction of his work entirely. He said it felt like luck. I told him what I am telling you now. It was not luck. It was pattern recognition that had been recalibrated. His brain had been updated to notice that signal. It had been filtering it out before. That kind of result does not happen from a single session. It builds. And the timing of your practice matters more than most people realize, which is exactly what I want to talk about next. Your brain moves through natural cycles of heightened openness twice a day, in the transition window just after you wake and in the period just before sleep, when your brain is shifting between states and the barriers between ordinary thinking and deeper processing are at their lowest. These are not random preferences. They are physiological windows, measurable in terms of brainwave activity, where the kind of encoding we are talking about happens faster and holds longer than at any other point in the day. Practicing during these windows does not just improve your results, it multiplies them. The morning window is particularly powerful because it sets the filtering context for your entire day. Whatever pattern you hold during the integration phase of your morning practice becomes the lens your brain carries into every interaction, every decision, every moment of noticing that follows. You are not just practicing in the morning. You are configuring your perception for the next 16 hours. The evening window works differently. During sleep, your brain consolidates the patterns it encountered during the day. What you hold clearly in the integration phase before sleep goes into that consolidation process, which means it gets reinforced overnight without any conscious effort on your part at all. Practicing once a day gets results. Practicing in both windows accelerates those results in a way that feels disproportionate to the time invested, because the overnight consolidation compounds what the morning practice started. Within the first day or two of consistent practice in both windows, watch for something specific that is easy to misread as coincidence. After 7 consecutive days of this practice, something happens that a single session cannot produce, and the people who stop at day 3 or 4 never find out what it is. I want to tell you what the 7th day felt like, because it was different from days 1 through 6 in a way I did not anticipate and could not have predicted from the outside. The first few days, the shift during practice was clear and real, but it still felt like something I was doing, an active effort, a technique I was applying to myself. By day 5, something had begun to change in the texture of ordinary moments outside the practice. The quality of attention I had been deliberately creating during the sessions started showing up without being summoned. I would be in the middle of a conversation and notice a clarity there that felt familiar, the same wideness, the same absence of background urgency, arriving on its own without any breathing sequence to produce it. It was subtle enough that I almost missed it the first time. By day 6, it was unmistakable. What was happening is exactly what the research on neuroplasticity describes when a new pattern is practiced consistently enough to begin forming stable neural pathways. The state was no longer something external I was visiting for 7 minutes twice a day. It was becoming the direction my nervous system defaulted toward when conditions allowed. Not all the time, not perfectly, but measurably, repeatedly, in a way that had a texture completely different from willpower or intention. It was structural. Something had shifted in the underlying architecture, not just the temporary state it could produce. The ancient practitioners call this threshold the clearing, the point at which the practice stops being something you do and starts being something you are moving from. The imagery they used across different traditions was remarkably consistent. They described it as the difference between lighting a fire and tending one that is already caught. Before the clearing, every session is starting from scratch, building heat from nothing. After it, you are maintaining and expanding something that now has its own momentum. The effort does not disappear, it just changes character completely. By day 7, I sat down for my morning session, and the preparation phase took less than a minute to produce the clearing I had previously needed 3 or 4 cycles to reach. My nervous system recognized the sequence and began responding to the first breath the way a trained musician responds to the opening note of a piece they have played 100 times. The body knew where this was going. It moved toward it willingly, almost eagerly, the way a system moves toward a state it has learned to recognize as its own natural ground. Marcus hit his clearing around day 8. He described it differently than I did. He said it felt like the volume on something he had not known was loud had finally been turned down. Not off, down. And in the space that opened up, he said he could hear himself think in a way that felt genuinely new. Not smarter, just less interrupted. Less noise between the thought and the response to it. Less delay between noticing something and knowing what he actually felt about it. He said decisions that had previously felt complicated started arriving with a clarity that surprised him. Not because the options had changed, but because the interference that had been obscuring them was no longer running at full volume. This is the threshold that 7 consistent days can produce. Not enlightenment, not a permanent altered state. A new baseline. A nervous system that has been shown, repeatedly and concretely, that a different operating frequency is possible, and that has begun to treat that frequency as a genuine option rather than a temporary achievement. And from that new baseline, the things you set in motion during the integration phase, the specific images and emotional patterns you seeded during the sealing window, began to compound in a way that single sessions simply cannot create. The signs that you are approaching your own clearing are specific enough that you will recognize them if you know what to look for. Your resting breath will begin to deepen slightly on its own during ordinary moments. The reactive pull of small frustrations will start to lose some of its grip, not because you are suppressing anything, but because your nervous system is running with more capacity and less of its resources tied up in background alert. Your sleep will likely improve, particularly the quality of the transition into sleep, which will feel smoother and faster. And your ability to hold a clear mental image during the integration phase will sharpen noticeably, the scene you visualize becoming more vivid and more emotionally accessible with each session. These are not poetic descriptions of feeling better. They are the specific markers that researchers have used to track neurological progress in subjects practicing coherent breathwork over consecutive days. They are measurable, they are reproducible, and they are available to anyone who does the work consistently enough to reach them. Here's what this whole journey has taught me, distilled down to the one thing I wish someone had told me before I spent years wondering why my life felt stuck, despite every effort I made to change it. You cannot renovate a house while the alarm system is going off inside it. Every tool you reach for, every plan you make, every vision you try to hold, gets filtered through a nervous system that is running emergency protocols. Not loudly, quietly, constantly. And as long as that alarm is running, the best version of your thinking, your creativity, your capacity to notice opportunity and move toward what you actually want stays locked behind a door your own biology is keeping shut. The breath is the key to that door, not a metaphor. A biological fact. The moment you learn to use it correctly, the alarm quiets, the door opens. And what you find on the other side is not a different person. It is the same person, finally operating without the noise. Now I want to ask you something directly, and I genuinely want to know your answer. Think about the version of your life you hold during that integration phase, the specific scene, the feeling of it already being real. How long have you been carrying that image without it moving? 1 year? 3 years? Longer? And be honest with yourself. How much of that stillness has actually been about circumstances, and how much has been about the frequency your nervous system has been running on while you waited? Leave your answer below. I read them. If this landed for you, like this and subscribe. Next week I am sharing the one addition that the ancient records describe as doubling the speed of everything we covered today. You do not want to miss it.